Okay, this is chapter 4 then of Atonement. Now this one is told from Cecilia's point of view. And we get a little bit of development, and most crucially we get the introduction of Paul Marshall at this point. So we start to get a bit of a feeling of what this guy's all about, what he represents. But this is told, remember, from Cecilia's point of view. So it's not maybe got the same sort of sense of danger and the same sort of sense of dislike and distrust for Paul Marshall as perhaps we might expect. So what we get in chapter 4 then, on page 44, are a few moments you could really look at. Okay, about 5 or 6 lines down we get the explanation that this would not be the first time that she, Cecilia, had rescued Briony from self-destruction. There's this image of Cecilia taking the motherly role of Briony. She's the one who's having to look after her, who's having to put her right. Okay, so again that emphasises Emily Tallis's sort of absent, weak status, but also that idea that Briony self-destructs, which again becomes ironic at the end when Briony essentially destructs the story. She rips apart this false ending that she has created. And we get a key motif about 5 or 6 lines after that, about a third of the way down the page. This line where "it's only a dream, come back," what Cecilia would say to Briony. That's a motif, which means a few words that are basically repeated at significant moments throughout the novel. That's how Cecilia ends her letters to Robbie. That's what Robbie keeps remembering throughout part 2 to sustain him. And when Briony goes to see Cecilia and Robbie in part 3, again, that's what Cecilia says to Robbie. So those words "come back" are there throughout the novel. We could interpret that as, remember, Briony is, supposedly sort of telling this story as a sign of her regret, that she wants this to come back. She wants Robbie and Cecilia to return to her. She wants to go back to the innocence. But also, I think it emphasises Cecilia's status as a healing presence, really, a calming presence. What we get then was we move over to page 45, second line down, Hardman, who said he was too old to learn to drive a car. So again, this reminds us that Tallis is their way of life is a little bit outdated. So in the same way that with that comeback line, we get the feeling that Briony's always itching to go back to that childhood innocence. And on the one hand, she can't do it because it's her fault that many of these things have happened. But also there's the idea that contextually with the war coming, with the Tallises being outdated, that their way of life and that bubble that Briony's in is going to go anyway. Partly it's the world that's changing. It's not just Briony's innocence. We get the feeling perhaps that she shouldn't be too hard on herself. Halfway down page 45, Cecilia lifts the flowers and lets them drop, and they fell into another orderly pattern. She's trying to put the flowers in the vase so that they look messy. Remember, Cecilia is this disordered sort of figure, but this neatness keeps imposing itself. Again, a bit of a metaphor for the way that within this story it ends up being a very neat story because it's Briony in control of it. Briony's in control of this narrative. It ends up following a similar pattern to the Trials of Arabella. In this story, Cecilia and Robbie end up together. Okay, the princess and the humble woodcutter, the impoverished doctor. Page 46, about 12 lines down, something like that, it mentions that Briony crossed the bridge to the island. Now, these bridges are a key symbol throughout this novel. Okay, Briony crosses the bridge with the letter as she's growing up, as she reads these words and these ideas that are, adults when she's so childish. It's there when she crosses and sees Paul Marshall raping Lola. It's there she crosses a bridge towards the end when she goes to Lola and Paul Marshall's wedding. She crosses the bridges when she returns and watches the Trials of Arabella. These bridges were always there at those moments of transition in childhood. Okay, so she crosses the bridge to the island at this point. It's worth noting when every time these bridges come up, it tends to be a sort of moment of transition, a loss of innocence or a return to innocence. About halfway down page 47, just over, Cecilia sees Paul Marshall and she wonders whether she's going to marry him. Again, a nice little bit of context there shows, again, that in this world that the Tallises inhabit, the idea is that a woman's function is to sort of, marry the right man. Again, it's that outdated pattern, twisted on its head when Lola marries Paul Marshall. Yes, he's rich. Yes, he's eligible in a lot of ways. However, he's also her rapist. So again, that's sort of challenge throughout the novel, I think. McEwan is in some ways suggesting that the war coming isn't all bad. It actually creates a perhaps fairer world. Top of 48, Emily's lying down. It was hardly necessary to say it. Again, it's a weak mother, isn't it? when Marshall is speaking to Cecilia, one of the first things he says, that might have been your sister I saw down by the lake. She was giving the nettles a good thrashing. It's a deliberately sexualised term, isn't it? Setting Marshall up as a slightly sort of sinister figure. As it goes on, however, a few lines after that, we're about 2/3 of the way down page 48, we get the mention that Danny Hardman, old Hardman's son, had been hanging around the children. It says she'd noticed him hanging around the children lately. So we get this sign of Paul Marshall being a bit sinister. But I think McEwan also reminds us that Cecilia gets this wrong. Cecilia, you know, throughout the sort of the time afterwards, she knows Robbie's not the rapist, but she blames Danny Hardman. Okay, it shows us how wrong we can get things throughout childhood. It's just a series of narratives, and that everybody's perspective is going to be a little bit different. But you know, one isn't necessarily more right than the other. Towards the bottom, there's the mention of all day long she realised she'd been feeling strange and seeing strangely, as though everything was already long in the past, made more vivid by posthumous irony she could not quite grasp. Okay, again, McEwan's referring to the style of the novel, really, isn't it? Where Briony is going back and describing these sorts of things. It becomes a slightly self-aware narrative. McEwan's playing around with these narrative conventions. We've got the sign of Paul Marshall towards the bottom of page 49. It describes him selling this ammo, okay, this chocolate bar that he sells to the military. It emphasises him as quite an immoral character who's getting rich out of this war and this horror, and also sets him up as almost the new way of things. He's the new money. He's the one to watch in the future as the Tallis decline. He's the one who gets rich. But actually, it's quite a dangerous sort of wealth. As the book continues, it's the wealth that stops Briony being able to publish this story. There's not too much sort of in the second half of this chapter, I think, that I would maybe draw your attention to in particular, but I think what is worth looking at is the last couple of lines where as she passed, so as Cecilia walks away, she felt him touch her lightly on her forearm, or it may have been a leaf. So again, there's that focus on the instability of the narrative here. Okay, we can't quite be sure what the real story is. We can't quite be sure exactly what's happened.